So there are millions of possibilities of things that we can get really shook up about. Injustice, oppression, poverty, war, slavery, mercilessness, brutality, ruthlessness. But something will trigger inside of us, and we want to respond. And the fleshly part of us wants to respond with sort of an equal amount of vengeance or hatred, and at the same time justify in our minds our response. But it would be an act that would be just equally creating of evil, wouldn't it? Hatred and death. So what is supposed to be the Christian response to evil in the world? What should good people do about bad things that happen? Although we don't find it directly addressed in the Gospel of Matthew, that's the question, or at least one like it, that's being implied in this parable of the weeds and the wheat here in chapter 13. And we've been looking at parables over the last few weeks. Here's the parable again. A farmer has a field, Jesus teaches. It's pure and perfect, ready to produce nothing but good grain. But in the night, someone comes and sows weed seeds into the wheat. If you're a farmer, you would already be thinking, wait, this is an interesting story. Weeds happen on their own. But when the wheat came up, weeds were there among them. And the servant said, do you want us to go out and weed? And Jesus said, the master said to them, no, wait. Later, Jesus would tell us what all these things equal in the explanation, which is separated by some passages. I would encourage you to read it and read those verses that separate, because they're important as well to the story. Later, Jesus would say that this is the world, and it's a weedy place, corrupt, not the way it's supposed to be. No one really needs to tell us that, do they? You look at the headlines just this week, you read the paper, watch the news. You do it enough and you find yourself shaking your head at the enormous difference between the way the world ought to be and the way the world is. And most of that difference leaves us feeling overwhelmed. What can we do about it? There are times, though, that we feel particularly enraged or maybe especially brave, and then you think that maybe you could do something about it. In this story with the farmer, you feel like you want to shoot your hand up and volunteer to go out in the world and rip out evil from its roots. And that's when the master says, wait. And I think that's what's surprising about the parables. Last week, I kind of introduced the parables. The parables work kind of like a wrecking ball to our expectation and understanding. It sort of prepares the way, sort of leveling the lot to the point where something new can be built upon it so we can see things in a new way, preparing us for that new thing. And they're full of surprises, and that's really kind of the point of this story as well, because we would expect precisely what the master does not do. If you have a garden, do you weed it? Of course you do. I have a blister right here proving that I weed a garden as well. Yeah, we go out and pull weeds. That's what you would expect this story to be turned into. We get stuff out of the field so that the wheat can be empowered to grow as much as it can and not be choked out. But instead, this master says, no, let the weeds and the wheat grow up together until the harvest time. And that's when this story stops being a story about gardening or farming at all, doesn't it? Because that really isn't encouraging to a wheat crop if you let it get overrun with weeds. If this story really is, as Jesus said, a story about evil in the world and God's response to it, then what Jesus is saying is that God doesn't have any immediate plans to uproot all evil. God's plan for now is to let it be. And here's why. When the servants volunteered to pull up the weeds, the master said, no, for when you gather the weeds, you're also going to uproot the wheat too. In other words, you're going to do more harm than good. Notice that he doesn't say that they could pull up and replant the wheat, but that they would, because of the type of weed, not be able to tell the difference between the weed and the wheat. We have this weed in Southern California that Jesus talks about, Lalium temulentum. You can find it here in California. It's not native. It was introduced here. It's also known in biblical times as darnel. It's a weed that looks an awful lot like wheat. Have you ever uprooted a good plant thinking that it was a bad one? That's the kind of weed that this is. We have corn planted, and there's weeds that come up, and for at least a few weeks, they look exactly like a sprout of corn. And if you let them go, they turn into a grass. But if you pull them up, you might be pulling up corn as well. It has a slender spike that runs out to bristles. It looks exactly like wheat until the point at which it fruits, and then you can tell the difference. It would be very difficult to tell the difference between wheat and darnel, at least in the early stages. And in a frenzy of weed pulling, you'd yank up the good in the field as well. Can you see how the same caution might be applied to our response to evil in the world? You feel the wrecking ball and the implications? If you don't come to the end of the parables and really feel kind of shook up about some of your conclusions about how things should be in the world or what our reactions are to them, then maybe you're not reading carefully enough the parables. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between good and bad. And sometimes in pulling up what you think is a weed, you actually do more harm than good. Back in 1979, the Southern Baptist Convention was beginning to deal with what they called the serious drift into liberal theology. And so they did a purge in 1979. They adopted a policy of what we might call weed pulling. And so they fired a whole host of professors and journalists and seminary presidents and denominational employees. Others resigned while they still could before they'd be fired. A great many people left the denomination in 1979. Similar things have happened in Lutheranism in various forms over the ages. The cost to Christ suffered. People were lost to the kingdom. I don't think the people that had the good intention of sort of bringing the church back to orthodoxy really considered that they would actually be throwing out a lot of weed along with some good wheat, but that indeed is what happened in that case. And maybe someday they'll look at the uprooted field of their denominational body and realize that their actions actually did more harm than good. And as I said, it's not just the Southern Baptist Convention. Other churches have been at it too. In the story, Jesus tells us that an enemy sows evil seed and then goes away. I think the details of the story are sometimes interesting. He seems confident that the damage that he intends will be done. Robert Farrar Capon, who's a theologian, Episcopal theologian, says that the enemy doesn't have any real power over goodness anyway. The wheat is already in the field. The kingdom of God is already in the world, and there's not one thing he can do about that. But, Capon adds, if he can succor the forces of goodness into taking up arms amidst the confusion that he has sown, we will do his work for him. That's why he goes away after sowing the weeds. He has no need to hang around, unable to take positive action anyway, having no real power to make up for the operation already underhand. He simply sprinkles around a generous helping of darkness and waits for the children of light to get flustered enough to do the job for him. And you know we do. But in this story, at least the parable that Jesus tells, that's not what happens. The master says, wait. Let the wheat and the darnel grow up together until the harvest, and when the harvest comes, I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds and to bind them together into bundles to be burned, and the wheat will be taken into my barn. Can you see that it's not the master's intention to have a weedy field? Sometimes that's what we conclude from this. Oh, God doesn't seem to care about the evil. That's not the case at all. It's just a different plan for dealing with them. His solution to the problem is ultimate. It's not proximate, meaning local. We often work in the proximate and forget the ultimate. And Jesus wants us to hear that more often than not, God's way of dealing with evil in the world, in our cities, our families, our churches, ourselves, is not ultimately immediate or local, but it's going to be an action that is once for all. And Jesus knows this. Jesus lived it. There was plenty of evil in his time. He lived in a time of Roman oppression. If you'd asked his disciples to point out the dozen or so social problems that they would have had in Israel at the time, they would have had no problem talking about poverty and injustice and prejudice and prostitution and oppression and drunkenness and drought and disease. Look at the world, they would have said, and the zealots did. the zealot said, there's a solution to this problem. It's to root out the Romans and to establish our own guy. And we can make it exactly the way we think it should be, and it will be perfect. It never works out that way. You do know that in the Middle Ages there were utopian Christian societies, right, in towns? Do any of them exist today? No. That would be a big no. Those utopian societies that we think we can establish by force or coercion or legal legislation never seem to pan out quite right. They were wrong then, and we've been wrong. If you read the Gospels carefully, you can see how little faith Jesus puts into political systems and political processes. He seems to be much more interested in rescuing people than he is rescuing programs, and doing it God's way, by going to Jerusalem, by being arrested, tried, and crucified, and as he hangs on a cross, it would be easy for anyone to conclude that God's plan failed, that evil triumphed finally, and that the field of the world was completely overrun by weeds. But that's not what happens. If you read all of the Gospels, you understand that the death of Jesus is that evil was somehow ultimately conquered. Look at our second reading for today. So that it might exercise dominion for a while, but it will not exercise dominion forever. So the church is to strive to be wheat in the world, to educate and resist evil without using the tools of the world to uproot evil. We're not passive. We are what he has made us. We are to be God's people, to be his wheat in the world. One of these days, the parable ends by saying, when Jesus instructs about what the meaning is, all evil, all causes of sin will be rooted out finally and at last. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but one day evil will receive justice from God. It will be overthrown, and the righteous, he says, will shine like the sun. In the meantime, we have to accept the fact that there are weeds in the field, weeds among the wheat. And rather than pulling up every plant that looks vaguely suspicious, we're to wait and educate and resist and shine. Because the truth is that none of us are completely free from evil. The saying goes, there's more bad in the best of us and more good in the worst of us than any of us in this life will ever know. The line between good and evil, the line between sinner and saint, goes right through people, not between people. All the more reason to leave the sorting of good and evil to God and to his angels, and for our part to spend our time trying to be wheat in the world rather than pulling up weeds. When the harvest finally comes, that's what will matter most, that the righteous will shine because we've been shining already. James Somerville, as pastor of a church in North Carolina, he talks about this decision process they had to make when they were confronting problems in a nearby trailer park, and they decided that they were going to start a children's ministry, but they had to decide what kind of ministry it was going to be. He said they could have chosen to sort of root out all the evil that they found there in the place, to chase down all the drug dealers, to get all the deadbeat dads, to confiscate handguns and arrest child abusers. Instead, he said, they ran a regular children's ministry. They put up a basketball goal. They told stories about Jesus from the Bible. They put their arms around little children and they sang songs about Jesus. And they did that for 2 years, every Saturday after Saturday after Saturday, doing these little things. He said after 2 years, he got a note with 5 words on it in his mailbox in the office. And it said this: Adrian wants to be baptized. Somerville said, Adrian, the terror of the trailer park, the little girl who had for 2 years made our work most difficult. Who would have guessed? Instead of pulling weeds in the field where she lived, we just tried hard to be wheat. And somehow Adrian saw that, and she fell in love with it, and she wanted it for herself. And after she was baptized, he said, there was a little more wheat in the field. And because Adrian, of all people, was there, soon there would be even more wheat. In a world full of weeds, perhaps the best strategy we can adopt as Christian people is the strategy that St. Paul told us about, basically from Romans 8 to Romans 12, but summarizes in Romans 12:21, where he says to us, do not overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is the word of the Lord. Amen.